When he burst onto the scene, Aiden McGeady had all the potential in the world to make it to the very top of the game. Although he had a great career to be proud of, where he certainly made a lot of money, Aiden McGeady never really reached the heights many predicted. So what exactly happened? From his early teenage years, McGeady was highlighted as a youngster who stood out for his tremendous skill and natural ability. There were high hopes as he progressed through Celtic's youth academy, often under the tutelage of Tommy Burns. Indeed, McGeady would credit Tommy Burns with forming him into the player he would become. He had me out many afternoons crossing and finishing. He'd then talk about different moves on the pitch and try to show me how to spin off a defender. It was Burns who made sure McGeady signed for Celtic when he arrived on his doorstep with then first team manager Martin O'Neill in the early 2000s. He'd make his debut for the first team in an April 2004 league game against Hearts, scoring after just 17 minutes. McGeady said he wasn't aware he'd be starting until O'Neill revealed the team sheet in the dressing room before the match, and with no guidance on what position to play, realised he'd be starting up front alongside Henrik Larsson. McGeady's Celtic career took off immediately, and he quickly found himself regularly starting games at just 18 years old. He impressed in his 3 Champions League outings in the 2004-2005 season, finishing the campaign with 5 goals in 37 appearances. Gordon Strachan was appointed Celtic manager in the summer of 2005, and although McGeady would contribute to Strachan's first season in charge, he missed a large spell of the campaign with a knee injury, which put Sean Maloney and Shunsuke Nakamura ahead of him in the pecking order on the wings. Strachan was far from McGeady's biggest fan, often criticising his tendency to showboat and attempt extravagant skills or flicks instead of focusing on the end product. The relationship between player and manager really boiled over during a December 2006 league game away at Dunfermline. As the match drew to a close, Celtic were 2-0 up, but conceded a late goal with goalkeeper Artur Boric arguably at fault. Club captain Neil Lennon started having a go at Boric, which resulted in Boric shoving Lennon. An angered Lennon then turned his attention to McGeady, accusing him of not tracking back to defend, despite the goal coming down the opposite side of the pitch where McGeady played. As McGeady explained this, Lennon got in McGeady's face, and the pair had to be separated by their own teammates. In the dressing room, Gordon Strachan sided with Lennon, stating that there were senior players like Lennon who gave everything to Celtic for years, and then there's players like him, referring to McGeady. Strachan continued, "Aiden, you might get a few girls when you go to a nightclub because you've got some fancy flicks," only to be interrupted by the Celtic press officer saying that Setanta wanted to do an interview with McGeady and give him his Man of the Match award. Strachan refused to allow McGeady to attend the interview, and their relationship was never really repaired. Despite this, McGeady once again became a regular fixture in Celtic's starting 11 the next year, especially following the departure of Sean Maloney to Aston Villa. He would go on to have his best season for the club in the 2007-2008 campaign, helping Celtic secure their 3rd consecutive SPL title, reach the last 16 of the Champions League for the 2nd consecutive year, and individually win the PFA Scotland Young Player of the Year and Players Player of the Year awards. Still aged just 22, McGeady's value was through the roof, and he regularly found himself linked with moves to the English Premier League. The following season was less consistent for both McGeady and the club. In Strachan's last year at Celtic, they missed out on the title late on to Rangers, and McGeady occasionally found himself dropped in important games. One such instance was a February 2009 derby game against Rangers, where McGeady was dropped in favour of new signing Willo Flood. Willo Flood was a player nowhere near the level of Aiden McGeady, so the snub was a sore one to take, confusing both the player and the fans. What is often forgotten, however, is that McGeady also missed out in an Ibrox derby game 2 months previously, when the manager had given McGeady a 2-game internal suspension and docked him 2 weeks' wages, as well as banning him from first team training, after clashing with Strachan in the dressing room in the wake of a 1-1 draw with Hearts. McGeady would have been silently pleased upon Strachan's departure in the summer of 2009. Celtic appointed Tony Mowbray as manager, who aimed to keep hold of McGeady for the brand of attacking football he was keen to play, in contrast to Strachan's often perceived negative tactics. It seemed like a fresh start and chance for McGeady to once again shine. In Mowbray's first league game, McGeady scored a double, including a sensational solo goal in a 3-1 win away to Aberdeen. But it was all downhill from here, as Mowbray's side suffered a horrible season, the club finishing trophyless for the first time in 6 years. McGeady made 50 appearances and put in a decent enough showing, but it was now a continuous pattern for McGeady of not showing enough consistency to satisfy all the fans. Much to McGeady's chagrin, Mowbray was sacked late in the season and replaced with Neil Lennon, the same former club captain he had the huge on-field bust-up with only a few years previously. The time was right for McGeady to move on from Celtic Park. Still aged just 24 years old, in total he made 252 appearances for Celtic, scoring 37 goals. In August 2010, McGeady departed from the club. Despite any previous issues, Neil Lennon admitted, "I won't be relieved at Aiden going because I'll be losing my best player and nobody wants to do that. But we feel it's good money for a top player." Although he was so often linked with a move down south, it would instead be Spartak Moscow that sealed a £9.5 million deal for McGeady, a club record income at the time. Lennon would use the funds of McGeady's sale to build an almost entirely new squad. The move surprised many, but the Russian club were paying McGeady over £40,000 a week, which was double what he'd been making at Celtic. McGeady made an instant impact in Russia, and just 4 months after his arrival, was named in the Russian Football Union's list of the league's top 33 players, ranked at the time as the second best right winger in the country. As fate would have it, Spartak Moscow would be drawn against Celtic in the 2012 Champions League group stage. McGeady started for the Russians in the first game between the two in Moscow, with Celtic securing their first ever Champions League group stage away win in a 3-2 triumph. McGeady was benched for the Celtic Park game in December, but did make a substitute appearance in the 61st minute, earning a booking as Celtic won 2-1 to qualify for the knockout rounds and consigned Spartak to bottom place in the group. His time in Russia was eventful, and he became a bit of a fan favourite, but wasn't without some controversies. In May 2013, he was threatened with police action after being accused of trashing an opponent's dressing room, the stadium director claiming, "McGeady literally crushed everything in his path. After he was sent off, he kicked in a pitch microphone, argued with the fans, then booted the door to the dressing room. He didn't just kick it, he smashed it in again and again until it broke. I've seen the damage, and so has the match commander and the police. It has caused widespread outrage. It's disgraceful hooliganism. The man has spat on our hospitality. What McGeady did falls under the criminal act of hooliganism. We have every reason to go to the police to press charges. We will need to discuss the matter with Spartak." And while he was eventually cleared of legal action, McGeady initially received a 6-match ban for the incident, which was later reduced to 2 on appeal. In total, McGeady made 93 appearances for Spartak Moscow, scoring 13 goals during his 3.5-year spell at the club. In 2014, now aged 27, McGeady finally made his long-expected move to the Premier League, signing for Everton in the January transfer window. The Irish international rarely started for the remainder of the season, usually coming off the bench in his 18 goalless appearances. Things never particularly improved from there. In his 3.5 years at Goodison Park, McGeady could never nail down a first-team position, and at no point did he ever start more than 3 consecutive games. His lack of game time saw him repeatedly asking manager Roberto Martinez for a move away from the club, if even on loan, but Martinez was keen to keep McGeady as backup, so he had no choice but to accept time dwindling away from him during what should have been the prime years of his career. Still relatively young, McGeady was starting to become a forgotten man on the big stage of football, and as some of his early critics had predicted, he was failing to live up to that early career potential. He was eventually allowed to go on loan spells to Sheffield Wednesday and Preston North End, where he did impress, but this was in the second tier of English football. Entering his 30s, McGeady signed for Sunderland in the Championship at the time, where an abysmal season saw them relegated after finishing rock bottom of the table. McGeady stuck around for the next few years, plying his trade in the third tier of English football. He was often a standout at this level, but a decade previously, this wouldn't have been what anyone hoped to see coming. Despite often being linked with a move back to his boyhood club, McGeady never rejoined Celtic. The closest he came was a year into his time at Everton, when John Kennedy rang McGeady to inquire about his interest in a return. McGeady still held hopes of breaking into the Everton first team at the time, so rejected the chance to join the then Ronnie Dylan managed Celtic, and the opportunity never came up again. Instead, McGeady would make his return to Scotland by joining Hibs in the summer of 2022 and was released at the end of the season, before he would finish off his career in the second tier of Scottish football, playing for Ayr United. He retired from the professional game in October 2024. Outside of club football, there was of course the hugely contentious issue of Aiden McGeady's international career. Prior to joining Celtic as a teenager, McGeady played for Queen's Park Boys Club, who had a policy of not permitting their youth to play for their school teams due to conflicting kick-off times. Scotland had a rule which would not permit a player who did not play for their school team to be considered for a call-up to Scotland School Selects. The Republic of Ireland did not have this rule, so Celtic legendary goalkeeper Pat Bonner invited McGeady to join the Irish youth system, which McGeady qualified for through his Donegal-based parents. Later, Scotland national team manager Bertie Votes tried to convince McGeady to switch allegiance to Scotland. Born just outside Glasgow and based at Celtic, it may have been easier for McGeady to choose the nation of his birth, but he opted to remain part of the Irish team, making his full international debut in a 2004 game against Jamaica. This led to criticism of McGeady both in the press and from the Boo Boys at grounds around Scotland. He would regularly be targeted by fans when he touched the ball at away grounds across the country. With such a recurrent theme of anti-Irish racism permeating Scottish society throughout the years, McGeady would later point out the bigoted nature of the targeting, stating, "There are plenty of Scottish players that have played for other teams. Did Scott Arfield not play for Canada? Brian McLean? He chose Northern Ireland. Did they get the same abuse as me? No. Why did I get that abuse? It's small-minded individuals, isn't it? That's all it is. The other players I mentioned, why did they not get the same abuse I got? Any idea? Because I played for Celtic? Because I played for Ireland? Hearts, Hibs, Motherwell, Falkirk, everywhere, booed everywhere I went. They wanted me to fail. Plenty of other players have switched allegiances to countries, but they've not got all that. In a way, it's a compliment, because if they didn't think you were a good player, they wouldn't be bothering." McGeady would help Ireland qualify for both Euro 2012 and Euro 2016, though never managed to play at the World Cup. He earned an amazing 93 caps, but only ever managed 5 international goals. Nevertheless, McGeady never regretted the decision. If he'd chosen Scotland, he'd have ended up playing under the management of Gordon Strachan, while choosing Ireland allowed him the opportunity to once again link up with Martin O'Neill. O'Neill's assistant as Ireland manager was Roy Keane, who was once asked in the aftermath of an underwhelming McGeady performance for the national team what he thought, and said, "I think he can play a lot better, but maybe that's the story of Aiden's career." And in many ways, that is a perfect summary of Aiden McGeady's career. It's not a total summation, as McGeady, particularly in his younger years at Celtic, was phenomenal. He put in big performances on the European stage and in derby games against Rangers, and though he was never much of a goal scorer, did provide an impressive amount of assists. But for the potential he showed from 2004 through 2010, it always felt like there was so much more to come. He was a fan favourite to many, but a lightning rod of criticism for others. You'd think a boyhood Celtic fan who lived the dream, won titles, won Player of the Year awards, and earned the club a record fee would be universally beloved, but it just isn't the case. That really came to light in recent months when McGeady was an in-studio pundit for a Celtic game against Motherwell. Portuguese winger Jota had just returned to Celtic 18 months after leaving the club. Like McGeady, Jota was a tricky winger who got the fans off their seats with his skill and flair. Unlike McGeady, Jota seemed to be totally embraced by the fans, and when he came off the bench to score a 94th minute goal in his re-debut, the reaction from the Celtic supporters was enough to make an emotional Jota shed tears on the pitch post-match. Yet instead of empathy or understanding, McGeady was perceived to have insulted Jota. When asked if he found Jota's emotions understandable, McGeady simply responded, "Crying? Not for me." The comments seemed to come from a place of jealousy. An attempt to come across as a tough-talking hard man, McGeady instead showed his own insecurities. Jota was comfortable enough to display them to the fans, But with McGeady, there was instead a barrier. The reaction from Celtic fans was one of annoyance towards McGeady, which sums up his relationship with the club in some ways today. He could have been an all-time beloved figure, but there's a barrier there. Maybe it's less from the fans and more from McGeady himself. Make no mistake about it, on his day, Aiden McGeady was a sensational player. It's often difficult for highly rated youngsters to fully realise their potential, so McGeady shouldn't be overtly singled out for this. It doesn't totally define him. He had an excellent career. For anyone who still doubts him, look back in old Celtic highlights between 2004 and 2010 and you'll see just how involved McGeady was in so many of Celtic's goals during this period. But for many, the lingering feeling surrounding Aiden McGeady is, as mentioned, that there could have been so much more. Maybe he just came along too early. He faced resistance to his natural flair when breaking into the old school style first team at Celtic as a teenager. Neil Lennon once threatened to kill McGeady on the training field for nutmegging him and warned him not to do it again. Henrik Larsson took McGeady aside and told him not to listen to that and to just keep playing his game. If McGeady had more encouragement and was nurtured rather than stifled, just maybe things would have turned out so different. Or maybe he's just a bit of a dick.